pass to the next presenter, to François Durier.
Yes, thank you, Susanne. My presentation will be about the compliance of energy performance certificates of buildings and some good practices and guidance linked to it. My name is François Durier. I'm working for CETIAT in France. You know that the energy performance certificate you see on the right of this slide, an example of an EPC is a document informing about the energy performance of a building. Even if it is required by the EPBD, the form it takes and the classification it shows depends on the national or regional legislation. The energy performance assessment on the EPC results in most cases from a calculation by a software, and this calculation requires input data as shown on the left part of this slide. And you see that input data describe the building, its physical characteristics, the environment in which it has been or will be built, the characteristics of the systems for heating, ventilation, air conditioning, domestic hot water, lighting, and so on, and also the operation of the building, depending on its occupation, the occupation schedule, and so on. And the number and level of details of the input data depends on the complexity of the calculation method and can vary according to the country, the building type, the fact that the building is new or existing for some time, etc. What about the compliance of an EPC? A definition can be given saying that an EPC is compliant if it is established by following the procedures of the applicable legislation. The same definition can also apply to an EPC input data, which is also compliant if it has been determined or established according to the legislation. With this definition, you understand that an EPC or an EPC input data are not necessarily accurate or close to the true or actual values. The energy performance assessment has not the objective to show the actual energy consumption of the occupied building, as it will, for example, depend on the occupant's behavior, and the input data can also, in some cases, be a simplified value, such, for example, a default value. So compliant only means established by following the procedure of the applicable legislation, but not necessarily accurate or close to the true or actual value. The issuance of the EPC, you see it on the bottom of the slide, requires an expert who will determine the input data, use the software, analyze and publish or issue the energy performance certificate, and also will give recommendations for energy efficiency measures are required by the EPBD. And you see in the two red boxes at the bottom of the slide, the non-compliance type that have been identified in QUALICHECK project. For the EPC input data on the left, non-compliance can result from procedures that are not followed to determine the input data, wrong value used as input data, and evidence of compliance or proof of compliance that are missing. They can be required by the legislation, but they are not there. For the EPC, the non-compliance can be that the EPC is wrong. It shows a result that is wrong, that does not correspond to the right value that would have been obtained by applying the calculation methodology. It may also happen that the EPC does not show a classification that does not fulfill with the minimum energy performance requirements. So in order to get a compliant EPC, QUALICHECK identifies 3 steps. The first step is to have very clear procedures on how to determine and obtain input data and how to prove that these input data are compliant. The second step is to have very clear procedures on how to decide about non-compliance during the controls of the EPC and clear definition of related actions. And the third step is to have an effective control of the EPCs and EPC input data with sanctions. The Energy Performance of Building Directive requires that member states implement the control of the EPCs and define and apply associated penalties. On the left of this graph, you see that we also need a societal support to this. The procedures, the controls, the sanctions and penalties must be known and understood and supported by stakeholders. And this will lead to very high probability that the EPC is compliant. What about the compliance of the input data and the way to prove it? On the first column of this table, you see different ways or places where EPC input data can be found. They can be made available by manufacturers, they can be found into a database, they can be recorded on site by an expert, they can be measured on site, they can also be fixed by the calculation procedure of the legislation, for example, default value, fixed average values, pre-calculated values. On the upper line of the table, you see, as title of the three columns, 3 ways to prove compliance of input data that have been identified by QUALICHECK and that can be used or referred to by national legislation. The input data can be result from the control of an independent third party. It can rely on the declaration that the procedure has been followed by the one who determines the input data. They can also rely on the proven competence of persons of companies. And it is then possible to fill in this table with examples. For example, for data made available by manufacturer, a national legislation can ask that the data results from a test in an accredited laboratory. For data measured on site, for example, the airtightness of the building, the national legislation can ask for a measurement operated by a qualified person or company. Of course, all these examples can be used only if the applicable legislation forces it or makes it possible. We say that compliance of the EPC requires procedures on how to decide of non-compliance. That was step 2 of our three steps approach, and also require rules about handling of non-compliance in practice. That was step 3, we showed in the previous slide. In QUALICHECK, we identified 3 main guidances concerning those 2 steps. First, implement checks of compliance with very clear procedures. The checks of compliance are required by the EPBD, but very clear rules must state how to check on which samples of EPCs, how to decide on compliance. Then identify very clearly who is responsible for compliance. And finally, define penalties based on factual evidence of non-compliance with clear predefined liabilities. Concerning EPC compliance and good practices, a number of interesting examples have been identified and documented in QUALICHECK. They concern, for example, product characteristic database, sometimes linked to certification of products, guidelines for choosing input data, training and qualification of experts, EPC established not only at building permit stage but after building completion, and taking into account the changes between the building permit and the as-built construction. We also have an interesting example showing the usefulness of EPC database for deciding about the way the checks of the EPC have to be implemented. We have interesting example about the checking strategy for controlling the compliance of EPCs, defining sampling, focusing on certain aspects, and so on. We also have interesting example showing the checking procedures of the EPC and the way to clearly define sanctions and penalties. All this can be found in QUALICHECK documents, especially in a document which is called a source book on the compliance of energy performance certificates. Today, a draft that was written some months ago is available at QUALICHECK website, but very soon a revised version, a final revised version, will be also available. Interesting information on this topic is also available on several fact sheets, booklet, reports, and also several presentations at workshops, webinars, and conferences. And Alexander Deliyannis in this webinar will later show an overview of all the QUALICHECK documents that are available at the QUALICHECK website. That was my presentation. Thank you for your attention.